This is the story of Dana Air Flight 363. On the 20th of February 2018, a Dana Air MD-83 was making the flight from Abuja to Port Harcourt International Airport. The plane had 44 passengers, 2 pilots, and 3 flight attendants. This would be the second flight of the day for the pilots of Flight 363. The plane took off and everything was normal, and by 8:20 p.m., Lagos Area Control had cleared the pilots down to 22,000 feet, and soon after that, they were cleared down to 8,000 feet. As they descended, the captain briefed for a landing on runway 21 at the airport. The weather was a concern for them. They had a bit of cumulonimbus clouds on their way down to runway 21, and approach control wanted to know how they'd handle the clouds in their flight path. The captain basically kicked the can down the road and told the approach control that he would like to get closer to the runway and then make a decision, which isn't a bad idea at all. But approach control had bad news for the pilots of Flight 363. The intensity of the rain at the airport had picked up, meaning that it was now harder to get this MD-83 on the ground. The weather was deteriorating and the rain was now a full-blown thunderstorm. At 6:45 p.m., the jet was cleared for the localizer approach to runway 21. At this point, the captain noticed that the DME-2 was not working. DME, or distance measuring equipment, is exactly what it sounds like. The plane uses beacons on the ground to calculate where the plane is in relation to the beacon and passes that information onto the pilots. So to rectify this, the pilot switched the beacon over to nav 1 and the localizer track came on. All was saved. They were still 12 miles from the runway, and so they still had some time to go for the plane touchdown. Now all they had to do was contact the tower and get this plane on the ground. But they could not raise the tower on the radio. As it turned out, the captain had made a mistake when punching in the frequency for the tower, and that's why they were not getting through. But a minute and a half later, the pilots were in contact with the tower. The first officer was now peering through the clouds to try and get a visual on the runway. The captain switched the wipers to full blast to try and get through the thick clouds that surrounded the airport. The captain then saw the runway. He said, "Runway in sight, landing," and he took the jet down. Just 32 seconds after that happened, they got the sink rate warning, which meant that the plane was losing altitude way too fast. But as the jet got lower and lower, the runway came into view more prominently. Despite the wind, which was at 22 knots, the plane touched down smoothly. But then the pilots got the shock of their lives. They were almost out of runway. As the end of the runway loomed through the fog, the captain slammed on the brakes, hoping that the jet would stop in time. He also extended the spoilers and the reversers. But that was just not enough. Despite maximum braking, the plane was slowing down too slowly. They needed more braking power, but there was no way to get it. The plane was at its limits. But before the runway could run out, the plane veered off to the left and started going through the mud that surrounded the runway. Even with the wet mud slowing the plane down, the jet went on for another 978 feet, and then it came to a stop. When all was done and dusted, none of the 49 people on board suffered from any injuries. They all walked away. The plane and the runway lights were the only thing that got damaged in this case. As soon as they got to know that everyone was okay, the investigation started. They needed to figure out how this plane landed. To know that, they needed to know where the plane landed on the runway. So they went over to the touchdown zone on the runway to take some measurements of the tire markings. But to their surprise, they found no tire markings where they expected them. They then drove down the runway hunting for the tire markings. They drove and drove till they found them. The touchdown point was 7,972 feet from the threshold of runway 21. For some context, runway 21 was only 9,843 feet in length, meaning that this plane missed about 80% of the runway, leaving them only 20% of the runway to actually stop on. Put another way, 7,972 feet, the distance that they went down the runway, is the length of some medium-sized runways. Put another way, pilots usually aim to touch down almost 1,000 feet from the foot of the runway. These guys touched down at 8,000 feet down the runway. It is absolutely incredible that these pilots put the plane down on the runway, this far down the runway. But why? They looked at the center of mass of the plane to see if that could have messed up the landing of the plane. I mean, if your plane is hard to control, it would be hard to put it down onto the runway, exactly where you want it to. But that wasn't an issue. The numbers all checked out, and the plane was perfectly balanced, just the way it was. They then looked at the pilots, and that's where the first red flag popped up. You see, the captain checked out. He had the necessary licenses and paperwork that he needed to fly. But they found out that the first officer was quite new, and he was not allowed to fly unless he was paired up with a check captain, and the captain of Flight 363 was not a check captain. Thus, this matchup went up against the rules set out by Dana Air. Here's a quote from the report. Although the first officer was trained and certified on type aircraft, he was not competent and eligible to operate the accident flight or any flight characterized by Dana Airlines as public transport. End quote. This definitely played a part in the accident, as during the final phases of flight, the captain was overloaded with work that should have been done by the first officer, and it was being done by the captain. This meant that the captain should have been looking at the instruments. Instead, he was looking out for the runway. All of this meant that when the plane went into the landing, they were carrying more speed than they should have been. They should have been at 125 knots, and they were at 135 knots. This approach was not stabilized, and yet the pilots went ahead with the landing. Making matters worse, the pilots were landing on a wet runway which was not grooved properly. When a runway is dry, the characteristics of the runway are very different to a wet runway, and the plane will behave very differently when the runway is wet. In this case, the touchdown was smooth. This gave the water some room to mess up the landing. In the case of a wet runway, you're supposed to put the plane down firmly on the runway, but that did not happen here. The water basically limited the effectiveness of the brakes. Why didn't the pilots do that, you ask? Well, they didn't get a lot of training from the airline when it came to landing on wet and ungrooved runways, nor did they have any type of simulator training for that situation. No wonder the pilots did what they did. They just landed as they normally would, not knowing that that would cause them problems. On top of all of that, they did not have a clear idea about the weather situation in front of them. They knew that a plane ahead of them had gone around, but due to a breakdown in communication with ATC, they really did not know how bad the weather had gotten. Communication with ATC was so bad that the pilots basically landed on the runway without getting their final landing clearance. That's how bad communication was between the pilots and ATC. This really feels like a crash where everything that could go wrong went wrong, and that extended to the runway as well. They found out that the runway had reduced drainage, which meant that water was at risk of pooling on the runway and then making the runway very slippery. The investigators requested data for friction tests done on the runway multiple times to the company that operated the airport, but they never heard back from the company. I wonder why. These friction measurement tests are very important, as that tells operators when to clean off the rubber residue from the runway and recarpeting operations to get the runway back up to operational standards. More importantly, crews make critical go-no-go decisions based on the runway braking action, especially in weather conditions encountered by the crew of Dana Air Flight 363. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.